This is another paper I wrote while I was in Indonesia. Um, Plato's Academy as a model for education in the era of globalization, educating the highest power of the soul, Nous, through dialogue. It applies to Indonesia, but it applies everywhere. This paper will briefly explain some aspects of how Plato's dialogues arose from the cultural and historical situation into which he was born. Plato responded to his intellectual forefathers and contemporaries, showing what he liked about his cultural tradition, what he thought needed to be completely rejected, and what he thought needed to be modified. This paper will be focused on Plato's response to the tradition of tragedy and epic poetry. This paper will argue or show that Plato's dialogues were the curriculum he used at the Academy. The Republic 7 claims that the power of mind, or nous, is the highest power of the human soul, and that the purpose of education, his particular form of education, is to educate this power. I have argued extensively elsewhere that the patterns found in tragic literature, as discussed by Aristotle in his Poetics, occur also in the stories of Greek mythology, Homer, and Plato's dialogues. Plato's dialogues both incorporate and add to the cultural tradition he was educated in and knew so well. The characteristics in the dialogues that follow those of tragedy, mythology, and Homer are as follows. They are poetry, not history, because they focus on the universal, not the particular. They describe the types of situations, types of human beings get into, the types of human characters, the way each type responds to these types of situations, the choices he or she makes, and his or her reasons for those choices. Second, Plato writes poetry because it's more educational than history. Poetry is more profound and sacred than history because its purpose is to teach. Human beings by nature desire to learn and take pleasure in learning. They cannot be fully human without the ability to grasp the universal lessons from such stories or mythoi. Human beings cannot become fully human unless and until they recognize themselves as a certain kind of species, a species with intelligence in a certain kind of universe. As a species, humans are both limited by natural necessity and possess the power and responsibility to form their lives and collective histories in positive and productive ways. One aspect of the power of noetic education is the power to make analogies between the myths and the existential situations of those who learn from them, their relationships to themselves, their families, friends, fellow citizens, foreigners, their histories, philosophies, justifications for their choices, which is what they tell themselves and each other about the gods or God, about justice, wisdom, truth, and beauty, in order to make the choices they make. Third, the plot is the most important part of Homer, tragedy, and Plato. In the case of Plato, the dialogues I will discuss are set when Athens is at its cultural zenith. The Athenians are convinced they are the school of the Greeks, that their city is the model all others ought to follow. The Athenians are blind. They do not recognize how they're abusing all of the institutions passed down to them from their founders and the generations since then. They will never believe that in a very few years they will lose the war against Sparta, and then elect a president from an old aristocratic family, who, in the name of a return to the good old days, takes over and tries to exercise absolute power, destroying all the institutions and customs the Athenians prided themselves on, the very culture that supposedly made them culturally superior. Fourth, the characters are types and true to type. The tragic character is an intermediate type, not extraordinarily good or evil, but well intentioned. They are the type of person audiences identify with. Plato's dialogues contain all types of characters, the best, the worst, and those between. Most of the dialogues include Socrates, the lover of wisdom, justice, truth, and virtue. Plato's model of how the best person would live and act in this kind of situation. Socrates argues with a sophist or some other adult whose character's been corrupted, whose way of life is organized around the desire for public honor at any cost, excess wealth, excess pleasure, or personal power. There are usually two kinds of intermediate types: a group of Athenian adults who are listening attentively to the debate, and a group of young people whose lives are not yet formed and who have to choose what they will value most as adults. The intermediate types make a mistake in judgment that leads to great suffering. They experience a reversal from happiness to misery, from prosperity to defeat. Their tragic blindness is to think that the freedom they are given by their constitution and culture is in itself the ultimate value. They do not realize that when enough citizens use that freedom to pursue irrational goals, the city will collapse and be taken over by authoritarian leaders. They are blind to their responsibility to cultivate good judgment in private and public life. If they do not love wisdom, they will not be able to sustain a stable society with intellectual and political freedom and political institutions that require citizens to govern themselves wisely. The young people go on to make the wrong choices and come to a disastrous end. The elders do not always live long enough to experience the collapse, but they've set the stage, they've corrupted the great legacy that was passed down to them. The characters are related to each other with bonds of affection. In tragedy, these bonds are mostly based on families and tribes. In Plato, the formation of a democratic society means that fellow citizens, not related by blood, are given the opportunity and responsibility to form strong bonds with each other, based on their relationship as fellow citizens, who together are governing their city. As audience members watch the reversals of fortunes, or as Plato's readers know what's coming, they must experience their own reversal from ignorance to wisdom. They must learn the lessons of the tragic characters in Plato's dialogues that the characters themselves never learned, or in the case of tragedy, they learned too late. You must be able to identify with the tragic characters, to have pity for them, empathy with them. They must fear for their own ability to make the same mistakes. Then they must purge themselves of the false opinions and desire to make the same wrong choices. Greek tragedy, Homer, and Plato's dialogues are written in a way that tries to educate an entire people, leading to a self-governing city. Plato's Republic is a paradigm of paradigms, the model explicitly set forth that the other dialogues follow. There are many cities in the dialogue: the city within the soul of each character, the city formed by the group of people gathered at Cephalus' house, the city of Athens within which the conversation occurs, the so-called ideal city in speech the interlocutors construct in books 2 through the first half of 5. There are also the cities in the readers, the cities in the souls of the readers, and the analogies and lessons they find in the Republic that they apply to their own lives, the cities of people they meet with to discuss the dialogues, the city within which they live while they are discussing the dialogue, and their own reaction to the so-called ideal city that Socrates himself completely rejects in the second part of Book 5. In the Republic, Socrates discusses the low road and the high road. The dialogue, as is true of all the dialogues, begins in the low road, the road traveled by the interlocutors, the world of popular opinion. The interlocutors' opinions all assume that human beings by nature seek pleasure, power, honor, or wealth, without any concern for wisdom, justice, truth, and virtue. About 1/3 of the way through, Socrates realizes they've come to an impasse. So they have to start all over again, from a new beginning. They must now assume human beings by nature seek wisdom, and will not be human or happy unless they do so. The dialogue, about 2/3 of the way through, as Socrates is trying to show the interlocutors there is a high road, another way to live. He asks them the most critical question. They simply do not get it. They don't know what's going on, what they ought to be learning. The dialogue then reverts back to the world of the cave. Although the interlocutors never do get the point, the reader can and should learn what the great teacher Socrates was trying to teach. The image of the divided line, introduced in Book 6 of the Republic, is also implicit throughout Plato's dialogues. The line has 4 sections. The realm of the visible includes the world of trust, pistis, and the world of imagination, eikasia. Pistis is the world of physical things, what we observe through our senses. Eikasia is the level of reality created by images taken from the world of trust, such as when a mirror is held up to the physical world, producing a set of images that look like the physical things but are not. The realm of the intelligible includes the world of thought, dianoia, and the highest realm, at the level of mind, noesis. Every dialogue begins with a carefully described physical and historical setting, the world of pistis. The sophist Socrates is arguing with represents the world of eikasia. He holds up a mirror to the physical world and the world of human behavior. In this world, it appears that what drives people is pleasure, money, power, honor, the fear of pain and death. The sophist assumes this view and creates a system of education and a way of life dedicated to helping young people achieve those irrational goals. At the other extreme, Socrates is motivated by his mind at the level of noesis, his idea of the good. The conversation taking place in each dialogue is at the level of thought, one type of thought, dianoia. Many different intellectual powers are used and discussed. In each case, the sophist has perverted that power and put it in the service of irrational ends. Socrates is exercising that power the way it is by nature supposed to be disciplined and exercised, with the power of Nous in pursuit of the highest human good. The reversal from ignorance to wisdom the dialogues try to trigger is the education of rational intuition or mind, and the recognition that Socrates is an incarnate example of what they are looking for. The dialogues explicitly end in confusion and impasse. The characters do not appear to arrive at any conclusions, but appearances can be deceiving, as one knows from tragedy in Homer. Under the surface, at the level of noesis, the dialogue is an image and speech of what justice, wisdom, virtue, beauty, teaching, etc. really are. They are not Platonic forms in some other world. They are actually powers, either powers of the human soul or powers in the universe. In his way of life, Socrates is an image and speech of what the form actually is. In the Laches, where Socrates is discussing what is courage, Socrates' way of life is what true courage is in the life of any human being. And I have a whole video about that, so I'm not going to talk more about that. Let's see. As is true in many respects, the Republic is the paradigm of paradigms. It states explicitly what is implicit in the other dialogues. The image and speech of the city in 2 through 4 is only part of the story. The image and speech of Republic 1 through 10 tells the broader story. The rulers in Book 4, those who rule the supposedly utopian city, are possessed what gets translated as good judgment, the type of wisdom necessary to rule a city in this way. Readers need to know that the word translated as good judgment in Greek is the same word used by Thrasymachus in Book 1, when he says that the perfectly unjust person possesses this power and uses it to get an entire city under his feet, to control everyone else in the city. Readers are intended to recognize that this ideal city is not ideal at all. Rather, it's a very authoritarian city, run by a small elite who claim to possess practical wisdom in order to get the entire city under their feet. And I have discussed the Republic elsewhere. Socrates expresses many reservations about this point of view throughout books 2 through 5, but Glaucon and Animachus go along, and no one sitting around the table speaks out against it. Then, at a certain point, Socrates explicitly says, we have to start all over from a new beginning. And then he talks about the philosophical soul, and he talks about philosophical education. It's an education for patterns. You start with math, geometry, harmonics, astronomy, but always learning what you learn from each one of those is pattern recognition. And then after that, he says you get to the point where you can start in the dialectical education. And Glaucon doesn't get it. He doesn't want to go there, and he doesn't go there in his personal life. Socrates basically says you need more education. Glaucon did not pursue more education. He got into politics. He eventually got killed. So, because Glaucon rejects his need for rigorous intellectual training, the dialogue reverts back to the cave again. Books 8 and 9 describe the four most common irrational goals human beings seek, and what happens to a city and a soul when it's ruled by people with those goals. The first type is the timocrat, the lover of honor. I've talked quite a bit about what happens when people love honor above all else. They'll tend to take a city to war for empire building. The second type is the oligarch, the lover of excess wealth. And again, I've talked quite a bit about the problems with oligarchy, and an oligarchy will tend to take a society to war for money. The third type is the democrat, the lover of equality of all pleasures and human pursuits. Citizens are given a great deal of freedom to live as they choose. And then they can choose. In a democracy, you can choose to be a timocrat, to try and get the citizens to seek honor and power. You can become an oligarch and try to get as rich as possible and try to drive the city into war for wealth. Or you can just dissipate your energy, be uninformed, entertain yourself all day. And the trouble is, when you do that, the society really needs everybody to step up and develop expertise and exercise it for the well-being of others. And when they don't, they create more and more instability. And then, as the society becomes more and more unstable, it needs more and more authoritarian rule. When it's unstable, somebody has to take control and stabilize it again. And so democracy tends to lead to tyranny. One person understands that the city is unstable and wants power, and he can say he's the man of the people, that he's supporting the people. He can say any rhetoric he wants, whatever is helpful, and he can be put into power either through election or through force or through a popular movement by the people. The two characters that stand out as the most extreme tyrants, the ones that wrap the city around their finger, Alcibiades and Critias, are at opposite ends of the political spectrum. Alcibiades was the quintessential liberal, and he could deliver a political speech and get the Athenians to do things that were not in their interest, such as go to Sicily. And on the other hand, Critias got the city around his finger in the name of a return to traditional values. And then the context was that Athens was at its zenith, and everybody in the dialogue was confident. They thought they had the best society. Then they corrupted it, they abused it. Eventually they went to Sicily, convinced by Alcibiades, spent too much money, had a big loss there. They became dissipated. And then Alcibiades got ostracized, and he betrayed Athens, gave the Spartans some secrets that helped them win. Eventually, they lost the war, and they elected Critias to return them to traditional values. So, um, so a society can have a democratic society can have all sorts of souls within it. It can have good laws and institutions, but it can also fall apart if the people aren't always pursuing practical wisdom. Then the Republic, the other Platonic dialogues branch off from the Republic. In Book 4, the Laches talks about courage. The Laches Dialogues is an elaboration of citizen courage as it's discussed in Book 4. The Charmides Dialogue is an elaboration of citizens' temperance as discussed in Book 4. Let's see, the Parmenides, Meno, and Gorgias dialogues are extensions of the discussion of sophistic teaching in Republic 6. Socrates says that the sophists educate the intellectual powers so that their students are better able to achieve irrational goals. Only the philosopher educates students to understand why the love of wisdom is natural, possible, and necessary. Each generation, especially among the ruling elite, must grasp and pass on the desire for wisdom to their children through informal role modeling and formal educational training. The Euthyphro, Ion, and Hippias Major branch off from the discussion of religious education and the way it is distorted and perverted, as it's described this way in the Republic. The Republic shows how the middle-aged and elders were teaching the youth that the gods could be bribed, that the gods wanted them, human beings, to seek wealth, power, and status, and before they die, they can buy themselves off by spending money on religious rites and festivals. They were telling the youth that what matters is to appear to be just and virtuous, so they will be trusted with positions of power and be given status and money. Adults were ambitious for their children. They were telling the youth that getting serious about trying to really be just or wise will only lead to poverty, lack of trust, and bad will from the majority of citizens, as was the case with Socrates. Getting too serious about living well and questioning others would lead to failed ambitions, public disgrace, and even possible imprisonment or death. And that's very ironic because the parents are telling their kids that the very kind of self-examination for wisdom that the whole city depends on, that it gave the opportunity for citizens to develop so they didn't need an authoritarian leader, is what the parents are now telling the children not to do. And instead, they should pursue all these irrational goals because they're free. So the society is theoretically self-destructive, and it's actually going to self-destruct. And it did. The kind of dialectical education in mythology, tragedy, Homer, and Plato is clearly trying to cultivate a passion for wisdom by showing the disasters that occur when people turn away from this passion. But none of them claim to teach virtue. None of them preach a set of principles or give a formula for living virtuously. Characters in Greek literary texts often claim to have principles or to act in certain ways that they believe are necessarily virtuous. In each case, the context shows that either the principle is wrong or it's not applicable in this situation, or that it is misapplied. All the texts show that living an excellent life is much more complicated than any educator can teach through a series of maxims or development of skills. The texts show that recipes for virtue are either ways the educated deliberately exploit and manipulate those they want to control, or else they are well-intentioned but have wrong opinions that lead to serious mistakes in judgment and great suffering. Homer is actually more like Socrates and Plato than he is like the sophist, making his work philosophical rather than anti-philosophical. And I wrote a whole paper on that, and there's an entire video on Homer and in the Republic. So I'm just summarizing here what I have much more extensively done in the previous videos. The Euthyphro and Ion show the kinds of perversions of religious texts and teachings that can happen in any society. So I have a whole video on the Euthyphro, and I have a whole video on the Ion. Questioning the status quo in the name of the gods must be done with much more care than Euthyphro gives it. Socrates himself was living a life inconsistent with what many of the Athenians thought of as pious. They eventually condemned and killed him, in part for being an atheist. In the Apology, Socrates is careful to explain exactly how he ended up following his way of life. His life was chosen as a response to the priests at the Oracle of Delphi. He took what he saw as his religious duty very seriously and reflected upon it continually. Euthyphro is much more arrogant. He seems to think his position as a religious leader, a publicly accepted authority on religious teaching, meant that whatever he happened to think at a given time in a given situation was what's pious and just. Ion's way of life corrupts religious teaching in a different way. He receives status and money from reciting the works of Homer to audiences at religious festivals. He's very popular and talks about how he can get audiences to cry as he describes the stories of Homer. Under Socratic questioning, it becomes clear that Ion has not thought about the content of Homer, the lessons Homer was trying to teach, lessons that include flushing out pity and fear, showing audiences they have to get beyond crying and self-pity in order to be able to see the mistake being made, learn the lesson, and avoid it in their own lives. Ion does not seem to have thought about any of this. He's reduced the most sacred texts, those that try to educate citizens, to mere entertainment. Citizens come to watch the great performer, to feel good, to get a good cry, and then go home, believing that is all Homer wanted to pass down. The other dialogues often include quotes from the wisdom literature of the culture. The context shows that those who can quote from these texts have not learned the lessons being taught. Instead, they're abusing their authority to quote from the text as a way to promote the very opposite goals. Applying the insights of ancient Greek literature and culture, especially Plato's dialogue, in an era of globalization. It should be obvious to readers that the author of this paper, as an American citizen, has been able to make many analogies between the world of ancient Athens and the world of the United States of America from 1945 to 2012. What might not be as obvious, yet I hope it is, are the many ways the lessons in ancient Greek texts can also be applied to the citizens in any nation in the world that has enough intellectual freedom to allow these texts to be read. True authoritarian societies would censor such works because they expose corruption among rulers and the ruling class. Their aim to educate citizens in critical thinking, the ability to examine themselves and everyone else, to question blind patriotism, blind religion, blind allegiance to custom and habit. The texts are aimed to get citizens to make the transition from living by the power of habit, custom, imitation, or by pleasure, pain, and fear, to living by the power of the mind, at whatever level each citizen is able to exercise it. Developed societies, including European nations as well as the USA, can certainly learn from the lessons taught by the Greeks. They also most certainly have ignored those lessons over the centuries and continue to ignore them today. Societies that claim to be based on democratic principles are exposed as driven by the desire for military might, economic empire building, license to live self-indulgently, and even the pursuit of personal power, status, and greed at the expense of everyone else in the world and of the future of humankind. Developing nations can often see through the conflicted legacy of Western culture. Westerners claim to think of nations and rulers as just if they cultivate the powers of the souls of their citizens, as the United Nations Declaration of International Human Rights describes. Yet the history of Western culture is a story of empire building abroad, internal oppression of the poor by the rich at home, etc. Developing nations continue to be exploited, intimidated, and held hostage to wealthy so-called developed nations who act like barbarians in their relation to the underdeveloped nations. Yet even as they begin to break free and to govern themselves, developing nations need to take note of the lessons the ancient Greeks wanted to pass down. The ruling elite, those who inherit privilege, or who move upward in the social, economic, and political hierarchy, will have all the temptations human beings have had in the past. The same types of people will arise. They will face the same types of situations. Some of them will make the same types of mistakes. The role Socrates plays in Plato's dialogues in Athens will always be the greatest need for every individual and every city. Everyone ought to live an examined life and continually examine their family members, friends, and fellow citizens, so as to ensure that authorities exercised wisely, that those in power have both the knowledge to be able to rule wisely, and the competence to do so, and the power to do so. Corruption will always exist to some degree. Some people will always reject wisdom in favor of power, status, wealth, or pleasure. A city's well-being depends on having a majority, or a majority of those with power, to guide the city toward justice, virtue, and wisdom. There will always be some obvious indicators of such leaders. First, are citizens able to move up the social hierarchy through the training and use of their talents rather than their family or friends? If a city is based on or turned toward cultivating a meritocracy, a society where positions of power are held by those who have shown that they're able to exercise that power, that particular kind of power. It's a question: is the society a meritocracy? Second, is the country cultivating a strong and stable middle class? The material quality of life that is understood to be middle class will vary between nations. It must include at least enough food, clothing, and shelter to meet basic survival needs. The standard will vary. It will be higher in some places than others at any particular time in history. Still, a healthy society is one where the middle class is growing and where wealth is distributed in ways that promote the well-being of the living and that position the nation for the promotion of the well-being of everyone in the future. Besides the obvious corruption of those with power, a nation can have a population whose expectations and definitions of middle class are simply unattainable and unrealistic. No ruler can pander to such expectations. Voters who expect the impossible and continually vote for whoever will tell them what they want to hear will eventually destroy the stability and prosperity they have. Rulers are corrupt when they use their power to enrich their families and friends and political supporters at the expense of others. The ruled are corrupt when they want more and more, cannot tell the difference between a just ruler who cannot or will not pander to their desires for excess, and a corrupt ruler who could improve their lives but is truly exploiting them. And the rhetoric would be that he loves the people and he cares about the people, and he ends up just reinforcing their corruption. Third, a healthy society will have citizens who desire to develop wisdom about public life. Such citizens keep themselves informed about the leadership in their nation in all sectors of society. They demand transparency, obedience to the rule of law, and diligence in using their power for the well-being of their city. Good citizens will not ignore the quality of their leaders. They will not wait until a few months before an election and then listen to political advertising paid for by people with irrational agendas as the basis for their votes. Such apathy and ignorance will inevitably lead to decline or present the formation of a stable decline of the formation or prevent the formation of a stable and prosperous society. Fourth, a healthy society will have citizens who know that all aspects of their lives are interconnected. They cannot separate public and private life. Good citizens exercise their power as parents, family members, friends, workers, employers, professionals, and citizens for the well-being of those over whom they have it. They become informed about the best ways to exercise each kind of authority. They recognize when their own leaders are incompetent or corrupt. The need for conscientiousness in all aspects of life will be intuitively obvious to citizens in a healthy society. The connection between public and private life will seem completely false to those who think private lives have any effect on their capacity for good citizenship and the future well-being of their society. This is the mistake the Athenians made, a fatal mistake that can be made, and often is made, all over the world. Fifth, a healthy society will have a constitution and institutions designed to promote the development of as many citizens as possible to the highest level possible. Opportunities for material and professional success must be tied to an understanding of the virtues and values necessary for individuals and societies to flourish. Developed and developing nations alike can be taken over by timocrats, oligarchs, self-indulgent democrats, or tyrannical souls at any point in time. It can happen quickly in a time of crisis, such as the terrorist attack of 9/11. More of this kind of terrorism is to be expected. Citizens should be prepared and not overreact. The current trend of the free market to invest in mass marketing that cultivates the insatiable desire for a luxurious lifestyle is bound to lead to hatred on the part of people from other countries. Trade wars, wars over natural resources, including military conflict, will get worse. The desire for excess material well-being will increase all of the problems that even relatively moderate and wise human beings have to address. Authoritarian reactionary movements are bound to occur. The issue will be how severe they are and how detrimental to overall human well-being. If the class war becomes severe, or if the people believe they're being exploited by the rich, socialist and communist parties will increase their membership. A tyrannical soul will use such conflict to gain personal power, like Stalin did. If capitalism leads to the breakdown of family life, religious belief, and any respect for authority, political parties who claim to want a return to traditional values will gain support and power. A tyrannical soul in such situations will gain power in the name of a return to traditional values and will drive a nation backward toward intolerance. The love of honor through victory in war and the love of success defined by extreme wealth must be rejected. The power of the military and business leaders must be checked and regulated by those who rule for the well-being of the ruled, by the philosophical, those who love wisdom. Those who profess moderation, compromise, and toleration must make clear that this does not mean laziness or toleration of greed, pride, or other vices. It must be made clear to citizens they have a civic responsibility to pursue virtue, justice, and wisdom, whether they do so as part of their religious faith or as part of their own vision of human excellence, apart from any concern about punishment or reward after death. Philosophical rulers must keep the most dangerous individuals and social sectors in check, while always cultivating the powers in the souls of citizens, so they can govern themselves and each other from one generation to the next. An outline for a college curriculum in our era. How can this paper be used to make recommendations about the best college curriculum in our era of globalization? My suggestion is simple, but hopefully not simplistic. I recommend a double major. Each student should be encouraged to have 2 majors, or a major and a minor, one related to questions about how to live well, and one oriented toward job skills. My description of the nature and value of study of the texts of ancient Greek culture is only one way to defend the continuing relevance and necessity for the education of young people in some version of ancient wisdom. Such texts show students the human condition, with all of its promise and problems, show them the kinds of critical situations they're likely to encounter, and show them why a pursuit of spiritual values is not only best for them, but the only way they can create a society within which their own children can grow up and live productive lives. This type of major or minor can be connected to a particular religious tradition as long as it encourages students to be self-critical and critical believers, believers who understand the many ways religious traditions can be corrupted. Students should study religion from many angles. From a positive point of view, a number of traditions should be studied that include each one's systematic theology, its teachings as described in narratives, its holy texts, the story of those believers who best represent the tradition. Education about each tradition should also include the stories of believers who were tragically manipulated to misapply their beliefs in the service of wicked rulers who used religion to manipulate them to gain personal power. It should also include stories of the most common ways that those who seek power have abused that tradition. Students must know that their religious beliefs have to be combined with a continual commitment to self-examination and the examination of others, never allowing a religious foundation to be corrupted by pride, greed, or other vices. Students should also major or minor in a more practical field, a field that teaches the kind of intellectual skills necessary to get middle-class jobs. This includes the social sciences, natural sciences, computer sciences, applied healthcare sciences, business, medicine, etc. Students should also be asked to write a paper that links these two areas together. It might be ethical issues in chemistry, or the effect of religious belief on brain chemistry, or the effect of religion on the nature of psychology and family life, or ethics in the business world, or biomedical ethics, or the many, many different viewpoints on the relationship between scientific views of evolution and religious beliefs about the origin of humankind. Students should learn, and professors should exemplify, the character traits of a liberally educated person as described, to give one example, in the catalog of the institution where I happen to teach. Quote, "In essence, then, a liberal education is the development of the most basic intellectual abilities, to reason clearly and critically, to read carefully and accurately, to speak and write precisely and persuasively, to interpret with insight and imagination. This intellectual cultivation, however, must be accompanied by the acquisition of the complementary values and virtues, intellectual honesty, the love of truth, fairness to opposing points of view, tolerance of reasoned dissent, patience with complexity and ambiguity. It is this set of intellectual and affective qualities that come together to produce a liberally educated person, who habitually takes a reasoned and thoughtful approach to any and every issue." Further quoting, "The development of the intellect that is the chief aim of the curriculum is the product of the critical, analytical, and creative study of established knowledge and currently accepted principles, theories, and practices. It results from careful consideration of issues that are of perennial and contemporary concern to thoughtful men and women, as it grows through reading and experiencing the finest moral, intellectual, and aesthetic expressions of our own and other cultures. In other words, liberal education occurs through the critical transmission and creative application of the best of the world's cultural heritage." Unquote. Professors who teach wisdom texts ought to demonstrate some skills and interests in the intellectual disciplines related to contemporary culture. They must be curious about the world their students are moving into. They must be able to make meaningful suggestions about how what they teach will relate to what their students will experience, even though the professor, him or herself, might never have had such experiences, or be asked to think in the way students will be required to. A philosophy professor who has no interest in technology will not recognize that as a voting citizen it matters when a political candidate has never sent an email, as was true of John McCain in 2008, Such a leader would not recognize the importance of setting up a committee to inquire into computer security in government. Such a leader would have no idea who to appoint and whether the recommendations are wise. On the other hand, a professor who teaches job-related skills must demonstrate familiarity with wisdom literature. They must demonstrate to students that they value the love of wisdom and recognize can understand the world through the unchanging truths presented in wisdom literature. A business professor who believes greed will save the world is simply ignorant of the wisdom learned over and over again, often the hard way, by first denying it, as the professor is doing. Undergraduate colleges throughout the world are structured to give students as many new experiences and ideas as possible. Young people are taken away from home, put in rooms with people they do not know, living with or near peers from all over the world who are raised with beliefs and habits completely different from their own, and then asked to take courses from a wide range of academic disciplines, forcing them to use their brains in very, very different ways. They are usually given a curriculum that's self-contradictory. Teachers in one discipline assume their discipline is incompatible with another one. Students have to cope with this animosity and intellectual schizophrenia. They have to please professors who require them to affirm in one class the very perspective they have to reject entirely in another class. The institution violates the golden rule. It treats students in a way most professors would resent by the time they become middle-aged. Those who were infinitely curious during college could easily become entrenched in their disciplines and less curious or open as they grow older. Institutions need to make clear that they want, even expect, their faculties to remain open to new ways of living and thinking, just as they ask the students to. Unfortunately, the professions reward higher and higher levels of specialization, leading those who seek status, promotion, higher salaries, and more professional power to become more and more fixated on a narrower and narrower kind of thinking and way of living in all aspects of life. Institutions gain prestige when professors publish in very narrow areas of specialization. Yet institutions and college professors need to struggle against the cultivation of narrow and obsessive ways of living and thinking just for the sake of more money, status, and power. Professors also get status for sending their students to graduate school, meaning they get rewarded for encouraging those students they think they have the potential to get a PhD, those with the most intellectual ability, to begin early on to narrow their focus, to use their intellectual talent in a narrow and specialized way, imitating their elders and leading them to over-specialize even sooner than those who are not identified as potential PhDs. The intellectual class becomes even less interested in the wisdom traditions and less able to cope with daily life. They cannot see the patterns shown to them in wisdom literature as they occur in their own lives, the lives of their students, and the lives of everyone they know. Like the sophists in Plato's era, many professors are foreigners, teaching in different countries or in different areas of the same country, people who do not identify with the culture and history of those they are living around or of their students. This can have an advantage because students who live nearby and cannot afford to travel or study far from home are exposed to new perspectives. Professors can learn about the societies they live in and become more reflective about their own values and their nation. They can develop a mature international perspective. On the other hand, they might, like the sophists, come and work to gain personal status, wealth, or power without any concern for the effect of their teaching on those around them. In the case of the sophists, the lessons in rhetoric they taught gave their students the intellectual ability to gain personal control over the citizens and to realize their political and professional ambitions. The sophists did not care if the motives of the students were wise or ignorant. They did not care whether the education they provided was leading the city to a worse future because leaders would exploit their people and achieve personal ambitions at the expense of the city. The sophists did not think that the fact the city allowed them in and gave access to the souls of their best and brightest youth should carry with it a responsibility to educate them to become leaders who would truly benefit their societies. Many professors today do not feel responsible for teaching the youth in the nations or parts of the country where they live the kind of love of wisdom and critical thinking skills that would give them the ability to lead their peoples. Of course, like all relationships, the teacher-student relationship is complicated. Sometimes well-intentioned teachers harm their students by getting them to over-specialize too soon. Sometimes well-intentioned teachers destabilize students by forcing them to question the values they were raised on too much and too soon, leading to moral relativism and a change from wanting to live for the sake of some higher good to rejecting any notion of any higher good. This is mentioned in the Republic. Sometimes cynical teachers justify undermining their students for the sake of personal status and wealth because, quote, everybody does it. Sometimes pure ignorance of the effect of one's teaching leads to a decline the professor has no idea he or she had any part in, as seems to be the case for Protagoras. Socrates was blamed for corrupting Alcibiades simply because he tried to educate Alcibiades and failed. Alcibiades learned the lessons of Protagoras and used rhetoric to help the city fall apart. Good teachers can have bad students. Bad teachers can have good students. Students can ignore or be permanently changed by their college teachers. Any possibility exists. One must examine each teacher and each student and each situation with a critical eye, knowing the kind of education that would be best and trying to understand the many ways things can go wrong. Conclusion. This paper has given one version of how to apply the texts and lessons of one wisdom tradition to the education of both adults and college students today. The nature of the topic is vast. The paper can only make suggestions and point in the direction of future expanded versions of the same issues. The era of globalization is leading toward the formation of a universal culture. This paper claims such a goal is possible and, if done well, desirable. So, I read this in Indonesia. Indonesians are particularly concerned about curriculum at this point, especially the ones at the Islamic State institutions that have had to liberalize their curricula in order to get state funding. But the paper just gives you the very bare bones model of what kind of education. I do think the major, minor, linking professional with liberal education. The description of liberal education is really good and applicable to any country. And then the short, abbreviated version of what the Greeks have to offer is what I have set up in the other videos, the earlier videos. So anybody who wants to explore that further, there's lots and lots of videos about many dimensions, and they're all named, and I'm going to have them numbered. But it doesn't have to be the Greeks. It could be something else, as long as there's this general. I just hope I've addressed some of the issues involved in higher education today that every country is going to have to deal with.